They forced a poor single dad to cancel his own wedding, right in the middle of a snowstorm. At a luxury restaurant in New York, the bride's powerful family slid a prenup across the table and gave him one choice. Sign it immediately, or the wedding was over. They thought he was just a quiet man with nothing to offer. Too plain for the family name. Too still to be taken seriously. A man who said varied when asked about his work, and drove himself, and didn't own a watch worth noting. What they didn't know was that the company they were trying to protect had already been bought by him over a year ago, through entities they had never thought to look into, managed by people who had never mentioned his name. The prenup was designed to tell him who he was. It turned out he already knew, and by the time the snow stopped falling, their entire world would belong to the man they tried to throw away. The snow had been falling since 4 in the afternoon. By 7, when the car pulled up to Veronique, New York's most talked-about French restaurant on the Upper East Side, the sidewalk had disappeared entirely beneath 4 inches of white. The doorman swept the entrance with mechanical disinterest. The city moved slower, quieter. The world contracted. Daniel Hartwell stepped out first. He stood for a moment on the curb, hands in the pockets of a charcoal wool overcoat that his daughter Emma had helped him pick out 3 Christmases ago. He was 41, lean, with the kind of stillness that people often mistook for shyness until they spent enough time watching him. He looked up at the restaurant's facade lit warmly from within, glowing amber through frosted glass, and said nothing. Behind him, Sophia emerged, brushing a strand of dark blonde hair from her face. She reached for his hand. "They're already inside," she said, in the tone of someone who had just swallowed something unpleasant. "I know," Daniel said. He hadn't asked how she knew. He hadn't needed to. The maitre d' escorted them to the private dining room on the 2nd floor, a rectangular space with high ceilings, oil paintings of the French countryside, and a table set for 7. 3 people were already seated. Edward Carter, Sophia's father, Victoria Carter, her mother, and Sophia's brother, Nathaniel, who had inherited his father's jaw and his mother's disposition to look slightly disappointed in everyone around him. They had arrived exactly 12 minutes early. In Daniel's experience, that was never an accident. A man who arrives early to a table he has reserved controls the room before anyone else enters it. He sets his materials down. He orients himself. He claims the space. He is already watching the door when you come through it. It is a small thing, barely noticeable, and it is entirely intentional. Sophia. Victoria rose and kissed her daughter on both cheeks. Her gaze passed over Daniel briefly, the way one's eye might pass over a piece of furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. "You look cold." "It's snowing," Sophia said pleasantly. "Hello, Dad." Edward Carter stood to his full height, 6'1", silver-haired, wearing a navy suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, and extended a hand to Daniel with a smile that reached exactly as far as his teeth. "Daniel, good of you to make it." "Pleasure," Daniel said, and shook the hand, and said nothing else. They sat. A sommelier appeared. Edward ordered a 2014 Burgundy without glancing at the list. The ritual of the expensive meal proceeded. Bread plates, butter curls, the small theater of menus being opened and closed. Daniel ordered the duck. Sophia ordered the sole. Nobody asked what she preferred. For 40 minutes, conversation moved through safe corridors. The wedding venue. The weather. A charitable gala the Carters were sponsoring in February. Nathaniel described a property deal in Connecticut with the enthusiasm of a man who had never needed to wonder whether his enthusiasm was earned. Daniel listened. He ate slowly. He asked one question about the gala, a genuine one, about the non-profit it benefited, and Victoria answered it with the minimal warmth one extends to someone whose presence must be tolerated. Then, at precisely 8:47, Edward set down his wine glass. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He placed a document on the table. It was 11 pages, folded lengthwise, bound with a slim silver clip. He slid it across the white tablecloth toward Daniel with the flat of his palm. The way a man slides a card when he already knows he's holding the better hand. We've had our attorneys prepare this, Edward said. A prenuptial agreement. Standard language. We'd like you to review it tonight. Sophia's fork stopped moving. Dad, she said. The single word was low, careful. It's a formality, Victoria said, reaching across to touch her daughter's wrist. These things protect everyone. Daniel did not touch the document. He looked at it for 3 seconds, the way a person might look at an object they have no intention of picking up, and then looked at Edward. What are the main terms? He asked. Any assets Sophia brings into the marriage and any inheritance she receives remain entirely with the Carter family trust. In the event of divorce, there is no claim on company equity, property, or residual income. Edward said this with the measured clarity of a man who had rehearsed it. As I said, standard. That's not standard, Daniel said. A small silence. It's our standard, Nathaniel said, with a thin smile. Sophia placed her napkin on the table. This is not what we discussed, Dad. We agreed. We agreed this needed to happen before the wedding, Edward said, his voice patient, immovable. The wedding is in 11 days. And if I don't sign? Daniel asked. The table went quiet. Outside, beyond the frost-laced windows, snow fell, without opinion. Edward looked at him directly for the first time all evening. Then I think we'd need to reconsider whether this wedding should proceed. He said it gently. That was what made it brutal. Daniel looked at the document again. He thought of Emma, asleep right now in their apartment, 6 blocks away, under the watch of her babysitter. 8 years old. She had already picked out a dress for the wedding. She had already started calling Sophia by her first name, with the comfortable ease of a child who has decided someone is safe. He thought about all of that. He folded his hands on the table. I'll review it, he said. It was not agreement. It was not refusal. It was something Edward Carter had not anticipated. Which was, precisely, the point. The first time Daniel had met the Carters, it had been a Sunday brunch in September. 4 months earlier, Sophia had warned him gently, carefully, with the hedging language of someone who loves 2 things that may not love each other, that her family was traditional. He had worn a navy blazer and a white shirt, no tie. He had arrived on time. He had brought a bottle of wine from a small Oregon producer he respected. Victoria had accepted the wine with a smile and immediately handed it to someone to put away. It never appeared on the table. They had asked him, over smoked salmon and poached eggs, what he did. Private investments, he had said. Acquisitions, primarily. What sector? Edward had asked. Varied, Daniel had said. Whatever I find interesting. This answer, he later understood, had been the first mark against him. People in Edward Carter's world did not describe their professional lives as varied. They had sectors. They had verticals. They had names that rang other names. A man who said varied was either hiding something or had nothing worth revealing. The assumption, in the Carter family, had settled quickly and silently on the second option. They had asked about his daughter Emma, with the careful warmth of people who admire children in theory. Victoria had said she was charming once, after meeting her, in the same tone she might compliment a restaurant's decor. They had asked about his previous marriage. He had told them briefly. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years ago of an aggressive cancer that had moved faster than anyone had been prepared for. He had been 37. Emma had been 4. Victoria had said she was sorry. The way she said it made the sympathy feel like a box being checked. What none of them had asked, and this, Daniel had noticed, was it self-telling was how. How had he built what he'd built? How had a man who seemed to own nothing visible managed to occupy himself with acquisitions? How had he gotten from wherever he started to wherever he was? They hadn't asked because they had already decided. He was a quiet man. He wore decent clothes but no watch worth noting. He drove himself. He did not mention clubs, boards, or affiliations. He was raising a child alone. He had said varied when asked about his work. The conclusion was obvious to them. He was ordinary. Possibly worse, he was ordinary and aware of it, which made him, in the Carter taxonomy, either a schemer or a dreamer. Either way, not one of them. Sophia had seen something different from the first conversation. He still wasn't entirely sure what. She was perceptive enough to recognize that stillness was not the same as emptiness, that a man who did not perform his power had not necessarily failed to acquire it. She had asked him, on their third date, why he never talked about his work. "Because it's not interesting to talk about," he had said. "It's interesting to do," she had laughed. And then she had stopped laughing and looked at him more carefully. That was the moment, she told him later, that she had known. The Carters had continued, in the months that followed, to perform their assessment. The conclusions never changed. Daniel was polite enough, they allowed. He was clearly devoted to Emma, which was to his credit. But Sophia had never wanted for options, and options were, in the Carter view, the only valid currency of a life well lived. He had heard, secondhand through Sophia, a fragment of a conversation between Edward and Nathaniel at Thanksgiving. Nathaniel had described Daniel as well-meaning but mismatched, which was the kind of diplomatic dismissal that required a certain practiced cruelty to deliver with a straight face. Edward had apparently said nothing to contradict it. Sophia had told Daniel this the same night, quietly, watching for his reaction. He had thought about it for a moment and then said, "Nathaniel's not entirely wrong about the mismatch." She had stared at him. "We are different," he had said. "I think that's the point." The Carter name carried weight in New York in the specific, stratified way that certain names did, not famous, not political, but woven into the fabric of institutions. The building of a business school's East Wing. A foundation that sponsored young architects. Seats on boards that mattered. Edward Carter had built that presence over 30 years with a combination of genuine talent, good timing, and the ruthless social fluency of a man who understood that reputation was a form of infrastructure. What Edward had not done, in 30 years, was pay sufficient attention to the financial architecture of the company itself. Carter Corporation had expanded in 3 directions when it should have chosen one. It had taken on debt to support a lifestyle of institutional prestige sponsorships, real estate, the appearance of a company in permanent ascent, without generating the internal cash flow to justify the exposure. By the time Daniel had identified it as an acquisition target, the debt-to-equity ratio was uncomfortable and getting worse. None of this was visible from the outside, which was precisely the problem. Edward's considerable skill at managing appearances had masked, for years, a structural fragility that his board should have addressed, and hadn't. Daniel had not relished the discovery. He took no pleasure in finding a man's weakness, but weakness in a business, left unaddressed, had consequences for the hundreds of people who worked there in good faith. That mattered more than Edward Carter's pride. What they didn't understand, what they had never thought to ask, was what he was actually worth. The wedding planning had begun in October, with the announcement that it would be held the 3rd weekend of January at the Langham, a venue the Carters favored for its dignity and its discretion. Sophia had not chosen the Langham. The progression was subtle enough that even Sophia, who was not a woman who missed subtleties, had required several weeks to name what was happening. It announced itself, not in grand gestures but in small corrections. Victoria had mentioned, once, that the florist Sophia had booked was lovely but a bit informal for a January wedding. The next week, a different florist had been scheduled for a consultation. The week after that, the first florist had been quietly removed from the calendar. The caterer changed. The seating arrangement was revised just a draft, darling. Not final in a way that placed Daniel's small group of friends and his late wife's sister in the far corner of the room, near the kitchen, the music. Sophia had wanted a string quartet she knew from a performance at Lincoln Center. Instead, she received a booking confirmation from a chamber ensemble that Victoria's friend patronized, with a note that read, "We've handled this one less thing for you to worry about." Daniel had watched all of this without comment, not because he didn't notice, but because he understood that the battle Sophia needed to fight here was not his to fight for her. She needed to find the boundary herself, hold it herself, or they would spend a marriage with her family mistaking his silence for permission. He had made this mistake once before, in a different context, years ago, staying quiet in a situation where his voice would have prevented harm, telling himself it wasn't his place. He had learned, at some cost, that silence which is intended as respect can be experienced as abandonment. He watched for the moment when Sophia would need him to stop observing and start standing beside her. He was watching for it now. The florist situation had bothered her for a week. He had known it from the particular way she answered his questions about the wedding planning briefly, with a flatness that was not her natural register. She was someone who enjoyed precision and beauty in her work and in her life, who had strong, specific opinions about aesthetic choices that she held without apology. Having those choices replaced without acknowledgement was not, for her, a small thing. They don't think they're doing anything wrong, she had told him one evening, sitting with her feet tucked under her on his couch, her laptop open to a project she was not really looking at. That's the part that makes it hard to fight. They genuinely believe they're helping. Do you believe that? He had asked. She had thought about it honestly. I believe my mother believes it, she had said. I think my father knows it's about control and has convinced himself that's the same as helping. This was, Daniel had thought, a precise and generous assessment. She was right about both of them. He had asked her what she wanted to do about it. I want to get married and have a life that's actually mine, she had said. Is that too much to ask? No, he had said, and meant it completely, but Nathaniel had been the one to push it too far. In late November, Nathaniel had called Daniel directly not to discuss, but to deliver. He had spoken about the rehearsal dinner venue, the transportation arrangements, and then, in the same casual register, had mentioned that he'd arranged for a brief review of Daniel's financials before the wedding. Just so we're all on the same page. Daniel had let the silence stretch for 4 full seconds before responding. No, he had said. Nathaniel had seemed genuinely confused by this. Not offended. Confused. As though the word had arrived in a language he did not speak. It's just a formality, Nathaniel had said. So is courtesy, Daniel had replied, and ended the call. He had told Sophia that night, calmly, what had been said. She had been furious, the clean, precise fury of a woman who loves her family and is tired of defending them. She had called Nathaniel. The call had lasted 45 minutes. The review had not happened, but the prenup, Daniel had understood that night, was already being prepared. He took the document home that night and read every word. Emma was asleep. The apartment was quiet. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and read the 11 pages twice, slowly, the way he read everything. The language was not ambiguous. In the event of divorce or separation, Daniel Hartwell retained no claim on any asset, property, income stream, equity stake, or inheritance belonging to or deriving from Sophia Ann Carter or the Carter Family Trust. Any joint assets acquired during marriage would be divided in proportion to documented individual contribution, assessed by a mediator appointed by the Carter family's legal firm. There was more. The document was precise, in ways that were almost admirable, if your admiration could survive knowing its purpose. It was not a prenup designed to protect both parties. It was a document designed to define his position. He set it on the table when he was done reading, and looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called his financial advisor, a methodical man named Warren Steele, who had worked with him for 9 years and had the excellent habit of never expressing surprise at anything. The Carter acquisition, Daniel said when Warren answered. Where does that stand? We cleared 43% back in August, Warren said. The secondary tranche closed in October. You're at 61% as of the 15th, so we have controlling interest. As of October 22nd, yes. Daniel looked at the prenup on the table. Good, he said. Keep everything quiet for now. Victoria called him on a Thursday morning, 6 days before the wedding, and asked if they could meet for lunch. She chose a hotel near Columbus Circle Marble Lobby, restrained lighting, the kind of place that cost a great deal to look like it was costing nothing. She was already seated when he arrived, in a cream blazer. A single strand of pearls. Her hands folded on the table, with the patience of a woman who had never needed to hurry for anything. I wanted to speak with you without the others, she said, after the greetings had been completed. I hope that's all right. Of course, he said. She spoke for 20 minutes, The speech was well constructed. It acknowledged his good qualities, his devotion to Emma, his composure, his evident intelligence. It expressed, with practiced warmth, the family's genuine affection for Sophia and their wish for her happiness. And then it arrived, gently, at its destination. "Sophia has built something extraordinary," Victoria said. "Her career, her reputation, the life she's designed for herself. We've watched her do it since she was a teenager, and we want to make sure that what she's built is protected, not because we distrust you, but because we love her." She paused. "The world is unpredictable," she continued. "Circumstances change. People change. We just want to know that Sophia will always be taken care of. That there are structures in place." Daniel listened to all of this without expression. "I understand," he said when she had finished. Victoria seemed to relax, fractionally. "The prenup is really just a declaration of position," he said. Not unkindly, simply accurately. Victoria's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. "I wouldn't say, 'It's fine,'" Daniel said. "I understand what it is, and I understand why you've prepared it. I'm not angry." He said this in a way that was clearly true, which seemed to unsettle Victoria more than anger would have. "I will not sign it," he added. "But I'm not angry." He paid for lunch. Victoria had not reached for the check and thanked her for the conversation, and left. On the sidewalk, in the cold, he paused for a moment and looked up at the gray sky. December had settled over the city with a quiet intensity. Somewhere across town, Emma was in school, probably arguing with her teacher about whether ancient Roman aqueducts should count as technology. He smiled at the thought and went back to work. 4 days before the wedding, Edward called. He did not ask. He stated, "Daniel, we need a resolution on the prenuptial agreement before Saturday. I want to be respectful of your position, but I also want to be direct. If it isn't signed, Sophia and I will need to have a very serious conversation about whether to proceed." Daniel was standing at the window of his office, a quiet floor in a building in Midtown, notable for nothing in particular from the outside, watching the first real snow of the season begin to fall. "I appreciate the directness," he said. "I need an answer, Daniel." "I'll have one for you by Saturday," he said. Edward seemed to interpret this as progress. The call ended on terms that were, if not warm, at least not broken. Sophia came over that night, late, after a work dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on, and Emma, who had been granted the extraordinary permission of staying up until 9 because of what the babysitter had diplomatically called advanced resistance, climbed into her lap without asking, and fell asleep there within 4 minutes. "He called you," Sophia said. "It was not a question." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd have an answer by Saturday." She looked at him over the top of Emma's head. Her expression carried all the questions she wasn't asking. "Do you trust me?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. Thinking. "Yes," she said. "But I want to understand." "After Saturday," he said, "I'll explain everything." She looked at him for a long time. Emma shifted in her sleep, one small hand curling in the fabric of Sophia's coat. "Okay," Sophia said finally, and she didn't ask again. The snow had been forecast since Wednesday. By Friday evening, it was arriving in the serious, committed way of a storm that intended to stay. Daniel sat alone in his hotel room. He had taken a room at the Langham, not from sentimentality, but because it was where the wedding would be held, and he wanted to understand the space and watched it through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He called Warren at 8. "Tell me the board composition again," he said. Warren recited it. 7 board seats. Daniel's entities held the proxy votes for 4. The other 3 were split among minority investors who had no coordination and no common interest. "The Carter Family Trust holds equity," Warren confirmed, "but no controlling votes. Edward sits on the board as a legacy director with no blocking rights." "And the debt?" Daniel asked. "Carter Corp has 3 tranches of debt maturing in the next 18 months. 2 are currently held by funds we manage. So if those funds, called the debt, The company would need to refinance within 90 days, Warren said. Which, in the current credit environment, would be difficult. Daniel had not acquired Carter Corporation to threaten it. He had acquired it because it was undervalued and mismanaged, and full of good people working for leaders who had confused legacy with competence. He had a clear plan for what it could become. He had been watching it for 3 years before making his first move. The business itself was, under the surface problems, genuinely interesting. Carter Corp had been built originally as an architecture and construction management firm. Edward's early vision had been real, and the company had executed it well for the first decade. It still held a portfolio of long-term contracts with municipal clients that represented reliable, if undermonetized, income. The problem was everything built on top of that foundation: the expansions into luxury property development, the institutional consulting arm that consumed capital without generating proportional return, the sponsorships and partnerships and memberships that purchased prestige at a price the underlying business could not sustain indefinitely. Edward had been constructing an identity when he should have been constructing a balance sheet. The company's employees, the project managers, and site coordinators, and administrative staff who had been there 15 years, already sensed the fragility. They worked in it. They saw the gap between what the company presented to the world and what it actually was. What they needed was not reassurance. They needed someone who would look at the numbers honestly and make the decisions that honesty required. Daniel's plan did exactly that. It was, he believed, genuinely good for the company. He had not bought Carter Corp because of the prenup or the family dynamics or anything that had happened in the last 4 months. He had bought it years before he had ever met Sophia Carter at a mutual friend's dinner party in July. That was the irony he had not spoken aloud to anyone. The man across the table from him tonight, sliding a document designed to diminish him. That man had been working for a company Daniel owned for the better part of a year. Without knowing it, Edward Carter did not know who had bought the company out from under him. Daniel's entities were structured in layers, held through management vehicles with names that meant nothing, advised by firms that maintained, by contract and by culture, total discretion. He had not hidden this from Sophia because he thought it was a weapon. He had told her, early and simply, "I'm involved in a company that has some connection to your family." She had looked at him carefully and asked if it would become a problem. He had said he didn't intend it to be one. What he had not anticipated was being asked, 11 days before his wedding, to sign a document declaring his permanent inferiority. He set the phone down. He looked at the snow. He thought about Claire. He did this less now than in the first years, but certain moments brought her forward, not with grief, which had softened into something that resembled gratitude for what they'd had, but with a kind of private conversation. What would you do? He thought. He already knew. She would have done exactly what he was going to do. She had been, if anything, more precise than he was about the difference between patience and passivity. She had never tolerated the slow erosion of a boundary, the quiet redefinition of who you were allowed to be inside someone else's framework. She had called it the soft takeover, the way certain people replaced your version of yourself with their version. So gradually you didn't notice until you looked in the mirror one day and found a stranger looking back. She would have named it on the first evening. She would have been direct and clear and warm about it. And the Carters would have had no idea how to respond to that combination. He had always admired this about her. It was something he had tried, in the years since her death, to carry forward, not as imitation, but as inheritance. Emma had some of it already. That directness, that ease with saying the actual thing. He had noticed it recently, and it had made him feel, with a quiet pride that was also a kind of longing, that Claire was still present in the world in the most important way. He ordered room service, a simple meal, eaten without ceremony, and went to bed early. He slept well. The wedding was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. At 9 in the morning, the snow was still falling, and New York had gone quiet in the particular way that only a heavy snowfall could produce the muffling of the city's constant noise into something that resembled, for a few hours, peace. Edward arrived at the hotel at 9:15. He had not been invited. Daniel had been expecting him since 8. They met in the small sitting area adjacent to the lobby. A space furnished with armchairs and a low table, Pale winter light, falling through tall windows. Edward was in a dark coat, his silver hair precisely combed despite the weather. He did not remove the coat when he sat down. A man who keeps his coat on has decided how long he intends to stay. I need an answer, Edward said. Good morning, Daniel said. A beat? Good morning. Edward's voice did not alter. I need an answer. I won't be signing the prenuptial agreement, Daniel said. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This one had weight. Then I'm afraid. Before you finish that sentence, Daniel said, there's something you should know. He had a folder on the table. Not dramatic, not thick, not ostentatious. Just a manila folder with perhaps 20 pages inside. He opened it and slid 3 documents across to Edward. The first was a summary of share ownership in Carter Corporation organized by entity, with beneficial ownership disclosed 1 layer below the surface. The name that appeared twice was a management company called Hartwell Capital Partners. The second was the board proxy documentation. 4 votes, controlled by Hartwell-affiliated entities. The third was a summary of the 2 debt positions. Edward looked at the first page, then the second, then the third. He went back to the first page and looked at it again. The color did not drain from his face dramatically. Nothing about Edward Carter was dramatic, but something went out of him, some structural certainty, like a beam that has been quietly compromised, and a building that has not yet fallen but will no longer bear the same load. This is, he began. Accurate, Daniel said. I've held controlling interest since October. Why? Not a question, not an accusation, something beyond both. Because the company was worth acquiring, Daniel said. I've wanted to reposition it for years. The previous ownership structure made that complicated. The previous Edward stopped. I founded that company. You did, Daniel said. And you built something real. But the last 4 years of strategic decisions have been costly, and the capital structure was compromised before I came in. I think you know that. Edward said nothing. His hands were flat on the documents. I'm not here to take anything from you, Daniel said. I'm not interested in punishing anyone. I bought Carter Corp because it has genuine value, and I intend to realize that value. I have a restructuring plan that protects the employees, preserves the brand, and addresses the debt. I would like you to remain on the board. Your knowledge of the company's history is useful. He paused. What I won't do, he continued, in the same even voice, is sign a document that was designed to tell me what I am. Not because I'm offended by the document, but because it was dishonest, and I think you know it was dishonest about who was actually in a position to be making conditions. Edward looked up from the documents. He was a composed man. He had built things. He had competed, and won, and lost, and returned. He knew, in some part of himself, what it looked like when a hand had already been played. She doesn't know, he said. Sophia knows that I have business interests that overlap with your family's company, Daniel said. She doesn't know the extent. That's a conversation I should have had with her earlier, and I'll have it today. That's between her and me, not you. A long silence. Snow fell outside the tall windows. The city was soft and white, and temporarily forgiven. The wedding proceeds as planned, Daniel said. The prenup is not going to happen, and going forward, the decisions Sophia and I make about our life will be ours to make. He stood. I'd like to get married today, he said. I hope you'll be there. He left the folder on the table and walked toward the elevator. He found Sophia in the bridal suite on the 4th floor, seated at the vanity mirror in a white robe, her hair half done. The stylist and the makeup artist had been quietly asked to give them 10 minutes. She turned when he came in. She read his expression, or the absence of an expression, which she had learned was different, and waited. He told her, all of it, this time, with nothing omitted. The acquisition, the timeline, the debt positions, the board seats. The reason he had not told her the full picture, which was not deception but a misguided instinct toward protection that he should have corrected months ago. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute. He sat in the chair beside her and did not try to fill the silence. "So when my father was threatening to cancel the wedding," she said at last, "he was technically threatening on behalf of a company you own, and the prenup was meant to protect assets from a man who already controls the entity those assets depend on." In effect, she looked at him in the mirror. Her expression was unreadable for another moment, and then slowly, unmistakably, something in it shifted towards something that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. "You should have told me sooner," she said. "I know, not about the company. I understand why that was complicated." She turned to face him directly. "About all of it. About how serious it had gotten with my family. I felt like I was fighting alone." "You were," he said. "I was wrong to let that happen." She looked at him. He looked back. "Did you talk to my father?" she asked. "How did that go?" "He's processing," Daniel said. A pause. "Is he going to be at the wedding?" "I believe so." Sophia turned back to the mirror. She looked at herself half done, which was, she had once told him, "the moment you looked most like yourself." Before the performance began, "Call the stylist back in," she said. He reached for the door. "Daniel." He stopped. "I'm not angry," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I just want you to know going forward that I'm not someone who needs to be protected from information, even information that's complicated. Even information about people I love." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." She nodded once. That was enough. The ceremony began at 2:15, 15 minutes behind schedule because the florist had been delayed by the snow. Nobody complained. The room was full of pale winter light and the sound of a string quartet playing something slow and unhurried. Emma, in a dress the color of frost, walked ahead of her father down the aisle with the careful gravity of a child performing an important task, scattering white rose petals with great deliberateness. She had been practicing for 2 weeks. Edward Carter sat in the front row on the bride's side. His expression, when Daniel passed him, was not warm. But it was present. That, for now, was sufficient. Victoria had managed, with the considerable resources of her composure, to arrange her face into something resembling a mother's joy for her daughter's wedding day. Whether the emotion beneath it was genuine, Daniel did not speculate. It was not his business to audit. Nathaniel sat beside his parents. He did not meet Daniel's eyes. When Sophia appeared at the entrance to the room, the light from the tall windows caught her. And Daniel, who did not frequently feel sucker-punched by beauty, who had long since learned that loveliness resides in more than the visible, stopped thinking about any of it. She walked toward him through the pale winter light and the quiet music, and she was smiling, not the composed, strategic smile she kept for her professional life, but the real one, the one he had first seen 6 months ago on a Tuesday evening when she had laughed unexpectedly at something Emma had said. And the real person had surfaced without permission. He held out his hand when she reached him. She took it. The officiant spoke. The vows were their own words, written over 3 evenings at the kitchen table in a process that had involved considerably more revision than either of them had expected. Emma, standing to the side, held the rings with the focused attention of a child who has been told this is important and has decided to take the instruction seriously. When it was done, the room filled with the sound of people who were, most of them, genuinely glad. In the weeks that followed, Daniel met with Carter Corporation's executive team. He did not arrive with ultimatums or declarations. He arrived with data, with questions, with a restructuring proposal that had been developed over 18 months and tested against every scenario his team could construct. The first meeting was on a Tuesday in February. He had reached out directly to the company's chief operating officer, a methodical woman named Patricia Howe, who had spent 11 years keeping the company functional through 3 years of strategic drift, and who, Daniel had been told by multiple sources, was on the verge of leaving for a competitor. Patricia had looked at him across the conference table with the measured patience of someone who had survived too many new promises to receive them with enthusiasm. "Tell me what you're actually going to do," she had said, before he opened the folder in front of him. He had told her. The debt restructuring, the asset consolidation, the reinvestment in the core business, the timeline. He had told her where the cuts would be necessary and why, and where he intended to grow. He had told her that the company's genuine strength, its long-standing municipal contracts, its experienced workforce had been systematically underinvested in, while capital was directed toward the performance of prestige. She had listened without expression. When he finished, she asked 5 sharp questions. He answered 4, cleanly. On the 5th, he said, "That's a legitimate problem, and I don't have a complete answer yet. I'd like your thinking on it." She had been quiet for a moment. "Okay," she had said. Not warm, not sold, just, "okay." The response of a professional who is suspending judgment but has not suspended attention. That was sufficient. Daniel understood that trust between people who work together is built in increments, and that the first increment is simply, "This person will not waste my time." The employees of Carter Corp had been living in the low-grade anxiety of a company that everyone could sense was drifting. The first all hands, when Daniel addressed the full staff for the first time as the company's controlling shareholder, was not theatrical. He explained the plan. He explained the timeline. He explained what would change and what would not. The applause at the end was not enthusiastic. It was relieved. Edward agreed to remain on the board. He attended the first 2 meetings in the coiled silence of a man reconstructing his understanding of a situation. And by the 3rd, he had asked 3 sharp and genuinely useful questions about the restructuring of the company's legacy contracts. Daniel answered them seriously. He did not perform gratitude for Edward's participation, and he did not diminish it. He engaged with the substance of what was offered. That was how it began. It did not become warmth quickly. There was too much for that, too much assumption, too much condescension, too much history in which a man had been weighed and found, incorrectly, to be without substance. But something changed, slowly. Edward was not, underneath it all, a stupid man. He was a proud one, which was different. And pride could, in the right conditions, be redirected. By March, he had stopped attending board meetings in the posture of a man performing composure, and had started attending them as himself, someone with deep knowledge of a company's history, who had made real mistakes, and was deciding, at 64, what to do with what remained of his professional life. Victoria remained careful, polite. She sent a handwritten note after the wedding that was gracious without being effusive. At Christmas, she spent 40 uninterrupted minutes talking to Emma about a book. Emma was reading a thick fantasy novel about an empress and her court, and emerged from the conversation with the look of a woman who had been surprised by Lucky Senta, something she hadn't expected to enjoy. She said nothing to Daniel about it directly. She didn't need to. Emma, for her part, had no interest in any of the adult politics. She had Sophia, she had her father, she had a new room in the apartment they had found uptown, with a window seat that looked out over a courtyard where pigeons convened with great seriousness every morning. These were the relevant facts. Everything else was background. Nathaniel was the hardest. He had structured his identity around his position in a family hierarchy that had, in the course of one January morning, been quietly reorganized. He avoided Daniel for 2 months, and when they eventually sat in the same room at a family dinner in March, the conversation was civil and minimal. Daniel did not push. Some recalibrations took longer than others. Nathaniel was 35 and had lived his whole life inside a story where his family was the center of gravity. Accepting that the gravity had shifted required something he had not yet been asked to develop: the willingness to be wrong about someone without it collapsing who he was. Daniel was patient. He had time. He and Sophia developed, over the early months, the private vocabulary of a real marriage, not performed ease, but the actual thing, which was slower to arrive and more durable when it did. They argued about small things and resolved them. They found the rhythms of a shared life, which required more negotiation than either had anticipated and yielded more comfort than either had expected. There was the question of Emma, which turned out not to be a question at all. Sophia had understood from very early on that Emma was not a complication to be navigated, but a person to be known. She had approached this with the same precision she brought to her architectural work, carefully, without rushing toward a result before the foundation was ready. Emma had responded to this with the frank, uncomplicated trust of a child who recognizes when an adult is actually paying attention, and the three of them had found, over the course of a winter and a spring, the specific shape of what they were becoming. On a Sunday morning in February, when snow was again falling, a lighter snow this time, brief and gentle Daniel was at the kitchen table reviewing a document when Emma climbed onto the chair beside him and leaned against his arm. "Dad," she said, "is Sophia going to keep her last name?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I was thinking," Emma said, with the careful air of a child who has been thinking seriously, "that if she keeps Carter, and we're still Hartwell, then we're three different names, which is a lot for one family." He considered this. "That's a good point," he said. "She could be Carter Hartwell," Emma offered. "Or I could be Hartwell Carter. Or you could be all three." She thought about it. "Actually, that's too many names." He smiled. "We can talk to her about it." "I already have thoughts," Emma added, which was her way of saying she had already made a decision and was now managing the rollout. "I'm sure you do," Daniel said. Emma nodded, satisfied with this, and climbed down from the chair and went back to her book, the thick fantasy novel, which she had now read twice and was reading again with the systematic focus of someone conducting a serious second investigation. He looked at the falling snow through the kitchen window. He thought about the restaurant in January, the 11-page document, the silver clip. He thought about a man who had arrived at a table, believing he was the one with the hand. He felt no triumph about any of it. Triumph required an adversary you had wanted to defeat, and he had never wanted that. What he had wanted was simple, and remained simple. A life built on honesty, in which the people he loved were not used as instruments of leverage by people who confused authority with love. He thought about Claire again, briefly, as he sometimes did in these quiet Sunday morning moments, not with sadness but with the steady, grateful knowledge that the things she had taught him were still operating in the world, through him, through Emma, through every choice he had made that came from that foundation rather than from fear or pride or the desire to be recognized. He had that now. More of it than he had expected, and in a shape he hadn't anticipated. Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of coffee, her hair loose, wearing the oversized sweater she had claimed from his closet in November and not returned. "Emma wants to renegotiate the family naming situation," he said. "I know. She sent me a preliminary proposal last night." She handed him his cup and sat down across from him. It included a footnote citing precedent from the Empress novel. Sophia sat down, wrapping her hands around her cup. "She's going to be terrifying when she grows up." "She's already terrifying," Daniel said. Sophia smiled. The real smile. The one that had surfaced, without permission, on a Tuesday evening 6 months before the wedding, and had been arriving regularly ever since. Outside, the snow fell lightly, without urgency. The city was quiet. They drank their coffee. Some men prove themselves with noise. Others simply wait for the truth to catch up with the assumption. The distance between those two approaches is the distance between power that performs itself and power that simply is. Daniel Hartwell had never needed anyone to understand him. In the end, they all did.